Ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Fall River Symphony Orchestra 2021 season. That was Arilyn Mitchell playing a piece by Thomas Wiggins. Unbelievably beautiful. She almost had me mesmerized there for just a second. That's called Water and Moonlight. We're going to talk about it a little bit later. It is arranged by Diane Michaels. It's from a collection of romantic solos, 3 romantic solos for harp by African composers or African American composers. It's nice to have you here, and this is our 3rd installment in this series, and I want to encourage you to go back and watch the other 2. I've given a more of an elaborate introduction, so I'm going to give a slight abbreviated one this afternoon because we have so much music to listen to and to enjoy. But I will briefly talk about our goals for this program. I think it's important that you hear that now. First, we want to acknowledge these composers, the composers of African descent, and their artistic contributions. Secondly, we want to educate our audience and give them some sort of historical relevance and influence. And lastly, we want you to experience the music through live performances. So welcome. This is our 95th season at Fall River Symphony Orchestra, and we're still going strong. We've had a lot of support, in particular with our partners, our collaborators. Today, we're collaborating with the Narrow Center of Arts here in Fall River, Massachusetts. This is a fantastic venue. If you've never been here for a concert or performance, let me encourage you to do so. They have partnered with us doing live broadcasts and to enjoy their space. And here we are today. So thank you, Narrows. And we are joined by the executive director, artistic director, and co-founder of Castle of Our Skins. Hey, Ashley, how's it going today?
Pretty good. I'm excited for this, and congratulations on 95 years.
Yeah, 95 years. And like I said, we're still going. So yes, a lot of stuff to talk about. Let's jump in. Let's set the stage. Now, typically when I think of listening to a piece of artistic work, experiencing either it's visual or otherwise, I think it's important not to only think about the aesthetic of it. I like to also think about the economic lens, political, social, religious aspects of a piece and the time from which the piece was written. And we've been doing that during this cycle, during this season. We started the season in the fall. We featured 2 composers, Vincent Lusitano, Renaissance composer. We know he died around 1561. The political space around that time was monarchical rule, kings and queens. And the economic philosophy of that day was mercantilism. An exaggerated and really oversimplified definition of that is get as much gold as you can. It's a finite amount, and typically you have to get it from someone else. Of course, there were exports and explorations, but this idea really, I guess, influenced colonialism and imperialism. So that was basically the economic the philosophy of the day. Religiously, the Roman Catholic Church. It was in 1517 where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the on the door of the Catholic Church. So we had the Great Schism during the Renaissance, the breaking away from the church and the rise of Protestantism. Socially, if you were not part of the hierarchy of the church or the, so to speak, caste system of the monarchy, you were probably poor. You probably didn't have a long lifespan, and that was your fate. And that's going to come into play a little bit later as we talk about this. The second composer in our first concert we talked about was Ignatius Sancho. He came around about 200 years later. It was a totally different world. He died around 1780. This is, again, a different world than Vicente Lusitano. Here, Protestant religious freedom was really a big deal. And along with imperialism and colonialism, lots of settlements in the New World, in the Americas. And the economic idea here started to change in a major way. We went from that mercantilism kind of idea to the Industrial Revolution. We were talking about going from handmade goods to mechanized machinery to mass-produced goods. So this started to change the idea of finite wealth and more of the idea of creating wealth. Totally flipped that idea of mercantilism on its head. Politically and socially, we saw the 7 Years' War, where, again, Britain and the United States, Britain and France were at odds. France lost. And they had lost several wars, and the poor people of France were fed up. In the Americas, in particular, the United States, not the United States at that time, in the colonies, revolution broke out. And they won. And the French followed suit. French Revolution. They also won. And monarchy started to break down. Now we start to see more of a democratic society. In the United States, we talked about in our winter installment, which was in February, we talked about three composers. Chevalier du Saint George. He was born a slave in the Caribbean. His mother was a slave, of course, and his master owned his mother. He had him educated in France. He lived during the French Revolution. He actually was a general of a all-black regiment in that conflict, in that war. We also talked about George Bridgetower. He witnessed two revolutions of sorts, political one, the French Revolution, and the economic one, the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And kind of rounding that off, we met Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Now, in the United States, we were going through, and we're going to talk about this also later on, the Harlem Renaissance, this rebirth after this great migration. And Samuel Coleridge Taylor was this beacon of hope that kind of spawned on this idea in the United States. And he also loved the idea of Black music, music of those descendants of Africa. Today, we're going to focus on composers of the Americas, starting in the early Romantic, 1810, 1830, going to the late Romantic, 1910, 1945, into the World War II, and beyond. And again, that lens of economic revolution, the Industrial Revolution, in the United States. It was in Florence. It was in Waltham, and it was in Fall River. Textiles were really the big mechanized sector in the industry. And in the South, cotton was king. And who's to say was the biggest commodity? Slaves or cotton? That's a good question. So, socially, there were millions of slaves in the South. And the Underground Railroad, again, we're going to talk about that, was in full function, operational, and abolitionist, denouncing the proliferation of slavery. Religious leaders on both sides one side saying that it is our right to own slaves, we are doing them justice, and we're introducing civilization to them. They're nothing more than mere animals, so to speak. On the other side, calling that view a perverse reading of the biblical text, and those abolitionists and religious leaders denouncing this idea. This really kind of spawned a social revolution, a breaking within the country, a civil war, which led to the emancipation of slavery and the assassination of the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. This also led to several civil rights acts, the first of which is the 1866, which declared that all people born in the United States were U.S. citizens and had the inalienable rights, including the right to have contracts, to own property, to sue in courts, and to enjoy the protections of the federal government and federal law. It gave free slaves, free people, citizenship. There was a second act, 1875. I should say this. This is important. Andrew Johnson was the president in 1866. He was President Lincoln's vice president, and he became president after Lincoln was assassinated. He vetoed this act twice. It was overturned by the Congress. 1875, Ulysses Grant signed the Civil Rights Act, which we talked about in our last series, our last cycle, which was deemed unconstitutional and was solidified by Plessy versus Ferguson. So that's our setting for today. We're going to talk about that transition from slavery to freed people in this new world, and that growing, and trying to strive for freedom and artistry and just to be. And we start our concert today with Thomas Wiggins, born in Harris County, Georgia. If you don't know where that is, I'll tell you, because it's Columbus, Georgia, which is an hour from where I grew up in Eufaula, Alabama. Right on the Georgia-Alabama line, about an hour away from my dad's farm, my mom and dad's farm, is where our composer was born a slave in 1849. Both of his parents were purchased by a lawyer. His name was James Bethune. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And, let's get Ashley in here to talk to you about the rest of this amazing story. Ashley, tell us more.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, thank you so much for setting the stage for us, this virtual stage, this social and political world, to even talk about and listen to the composers that we'll hear today. As you did mention, born an enslaved person in Georgia to Charity and Domingo Wiggins, and shortly thereafter his birth sold to James Bethune, who had a daughter who was a pianist, had a piano at her plantation, and born blind, Thomas Green Bethune Wiggins, was very interested in sounds just in general, and very early on, when he was maybe about 3 or 4 years old, really showed a lot of musical aptitude. And James, the plantation owner, allowed Thomas to use the house piano and sort of explore around. Eventually, there was some more training, and once they really realized that he was incredibly gifted, some would say a savant, perhaps on the spectrum, a musical genius, really being able to replicate and just absorb so much and reproduce so much and create so much musically. Quickly realized this and realized that, similar to what you were talking about, being able to exploit that, being able to commodify that. So when he was around 5 or 6 years old, the Bethunes, they had started a long history of exploiting Thomas Green's talents. There was a formal debut when he was around 5 or 6 in Columbus, Georgia. He was then hired out to another Georgian planter, Perry Oliver, who parroted him all around the North and the South. And then there were literally freedom. There was legal battles, really, when emancipation of the enslaved people was legalized. The Bethunes really worked very hard to control ownership throughout the rest of Thomas's life. And it really became a family business to make sure that all earnings and all performances were controlled by this family, starting with James Bethune, the plantation owner, then his son John, then a very harrowing battle between John and his wife, who then had a second husband to try to gain custody and use the mother, Charity, sort of as a ploy to be able to gain custody, but really to make sure that profits and the fame of Thomas Bethune was kept in the family. Thomas Green, also known as Blind Tom, had a real uncanny ability, as I referenced before, to process perfect pitch, being able to hear things, being able to hear the rippling sound of water at night, for instance, and create a piece, or hear cannons during wartime, which would be a familiar sound, and trains, and replicate that. Some of his music, one of which I'm thinking the Battle of Manassas, where he depicts musically this epic battle. He uses what are now considered extended techniques. So banging with clusters, so no notated pitch, but using literally your forearms, reproducing train sounds with your mouth, for instance, banging on the actual instrument to replicate images that he could clearly see, even though he, of course, was blind. He, in addition to being sort of showcased around the US, he also was brought to Europe and to South America performing, often undergoing very rigorous tests, sort of circus style, from what I can glean in my own reading about his life, trying to sort of show as you would the glory of your prized possession, and undergo these rigorous tests to show his memory, for instance, to listen to other performers performing and then having to perform what they just performed, right, by solely by ear. His recitals would typically have multiple parts, 8 parts, ranging from classical selections, piano solos, caprices, etc., and then laundry lists, sort of a CBS list of a repertoire that the audience could then choose. What would you like for me to hear? And I'll play it for you. Memorized his repertoire. Accounts vary, but between 5,000 and 7,000 pieces from Chopin and Beethoven and other heralded piano works that would be considered part of the repertoire, and some other 100 of his own competitions, again, Battle of Manassas, which I referenced, and what we heard also being performed on piano before it was performed on harp, and would just walk around this musical genius, who his mother, unfortunately, didn't see the earnings of his talent in terms of financially, and certainly he didn't also see the earnings of his talent.
Yeah, what an amazing story. I'm just thinking about that circus style. I read somewhere that they marketed him as like this Barnum style freak. They referred to him as like this bear or baboon, and my understanding is he made them about $100,000 a year on these tours. and which was equivalent to about $1.5 million today. And he did this over a course of his lifetime.
30 or so years performing, yeah.
Yeah. So he was literally their cash cow. They really took advantage of, and he went all over. I think also he played at the White House. He had a command performance at the White House. So this was a very interesting life. So that was Water in the Moonlight, which we heard on harp, which I like on harp because of the glissandos, but it wasn't, of course, originally written for that instrument. So our next composer, José White. What a totally different life. Really around the exact same time. His mother was Afro-Cuban. His father, was it Don Carlos White, gave him his first violin lessons. When he was 18, he gave his first concerts, from my understanding, playing some excerpts from Rossini operas and two of his own compositions. He was also a prodigy, and he was born in Cuba, but went to the Paris Conservatory. What else do you know about this?
Yeah. So so much about what you shared is, I think, a great starting place to learn and to understand him. Fantastic violinist, as was typical at the time of being sort of self-taught or engaging with music through a familial lens, and we'll hear about that a little bit later in some of the other composers that we'll talk about. But he was encouraged at a very young age when he was in Matanzas, Cuba, by the American pianist composer Gottschalk, who had traveled there, heard him, and was really taken with him, and suggested that he study in Paris at the Paris Conservatory. José Silvestre de los Dolares White, or José White, did take him up on that encouragement and ended up enrolling in 1855 at the Paris Conservatory. There are two musicologists, scholars, both of whom are African American, where to try to understand musical impact and lives of African American composers, and really composers of the African diaspora at around this time, I always turn to, and those being James Monroe Trotter, Music and Some Highly Musical People, and Maud Cooney Hare, who went to New England Conservatory and lived in Jamaica Plain, for those that are familiar with the Boston area. So in reading both of their accounts as they describe José White, they have so many anecdotes after anecdotes, quotes to be able to share. And so I wanted to read a few of them. Of his audition specifically at the Paris Conservatory, it was said, and I quote, "He has played with an extraordinary animation, not like a pupil, but like a master, like a great artist who commands his auditory." The jury itself was electrified. The following year, when he was enrolled, he was already starting to win awards for his violin playing, and would eventually, when his teacher went on leave, would start teaching at the Paris Conservatory. There were many prizes and many honors, one of which, in thinking about what this would mean to me if I received, I smile at, one of which was a gold ornamented violin bow. Another was a set of diamond studs from the Queen of Spain, as well as the title of Chevalier. We referenced Chevalier de Saint-Georges, meaning knight, so a very high honor. Performed all throughout Europe, certainly in France where he was, but also Spain and throughout Europe. His home of Cuba, the Americas, and probably most notably in New York, where he performed Mendelssohn's E minor violin concerto in 1876. And really had great reception, as is typical of a musician at the time, being a performer, but not only a performer, but one that performs for themselves or composes so that they can perform for themselves. So a lot of violin repertoire, some of which we'll hear later on today, but performing his own compositions, which is very typical and traditional of a creative musician to be able to do. Of his playing, Some other quotes that I think are really amazing to share. Quote, he knows how to make his instrument sing. And when a difficult passage presents itself, he carries it with a fascinating majesty. He is an artist who has succeeded in taking pace among the best violinists in France and Italy. And since you had mentioned Rossini also penned a letter to Sir José, he called him, saying that the warmth of your execution, the feeling, the elegance, the brilliancy of the school to which you belong show qualities in you as an artist of which the French school may be proud. So he wrote, as I shared again in this long tradition of being a creative, a lot of music for himself to also perform. So a lot of string quartets, being string heavy, several fantasies, violin etudes, actually 6 violin etudes, solos, duos, and works for, again, his technique to be displayed. And one of which I know we'll hear at La Bella Cubana.
That's right. And there are two things I'm going to ask you about. Firstly, well, the first one is really not a question. It's more of a comment. Especially with such fine artists, sometimes we forget that he was also a top teacher. He was a fantastic teacher. He was the director at the conservatory in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And he also taught at the Paris Conservatory. He filled in for one of his teachers there. And the other thing that I read, I don't know if you came across this, is that he played a Stradivarius. Is that true?
I have not come across that actually, but I don't know. That would be more information than I knew about his instrument.
I think he did. So I don't know. I read and I was like, really? How did he get his hand on that? Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, let's listen to this. We're going to listen to violinists Beatty Ferreira and Mari Ingesson of the Fall River Symphony Orchestra, accompanied by Arilyn Mitchell. She's back on harp again. La Bella Cubana. Piece. I love it so much. Just what a great piece. So, Nathaniel Dett. Now, earlier I alluded to the Underground Railroad. And here we have an example of refugees from that escaped the United States into Canada and started a life. This is Nathaniel Dett's parents. They moved to Ontario after they escaped from slavery in the United States and settled near Niagara Falls. And there, he started playing the piano at the age of 5. When he was 16 years old, he took his first job as an organist at an Episcopal church in Ontario. And he was there for about 4 years. There, he got this great background in religious music, liturgical music, and also from his grandmother, African American folk songs, which he embedded in his sound, in his character, and it became a vernacular of his characteristic sound. What else can you tell us about him?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of similarities with who we just heard, Jose White, and specifically his La Bella Cubana, which invokes a certain time period. It invokes a certain cultural feel. It has references to sort of a strumming of a guitar-like instrument, and it is really specific to a certain kind of cultural sound world. And our Nathaniel Dett, or Robert Nathaniel Dett, is another one of these composers that really absorbs and takes ownership of a Black idiom in his music, as you referenced, learning from his grandmother and certainly other composers at the time. So our first Canadian composer, as you referenced, who ended up coming to the US to not only work, but also studied. So there was post-Reconstruction, a pretty big initiative. We start seeing HBCUs, historical Black colleges and universities, sort of come more to the fruition. They had been in existence prior, but more into fruition. And other conservatories like Oberlin, like New England Conservatory in Boston, like Boston Conservatory, start to enroll Black students and provide musical instruction as well. So our Nathaniel Dett was one of those students. He went to Oberlin in Ohio. He also went to Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, Eastman, and received honorary doctorates from Howard and HBCU, as well as his alma mater, Oberlin. He was similar to Jose White and a number of the composers that we talked about, really triple, quadruple threat. He was a pianist. He was a composer, so you can imagine some of his compositions involve piano. He was an arranger of some of those African-American spirituals that you had referenced, and putting them very much being an oral tradition, so learning it by ear, similar to Blind Tom, who would pick that up by ear, and putting that into a Western notated system, putting that into art songs. Lots of controversy around that, by the way, but he was one of those composers who took this very folk passed down from generation oral tradition and put that into notation. So it made arrangements, largely vocal arrangements, also choral arrangements, also instrumental arrangements, which I know we'll hear from later today with one of our pieces. And he was also a conductor, conducting often choral ensembles, not only of his work, but of other pieces as well. If that weren't enough, he was also an educator and taught the great African-American soprano, Dorothy Maynard, among other people in his lifetime. To give a little bit of a sense with his sort of musical vernacular, he wrote a piece called "The Ordering of Moses," which was the first large oratorio, so a large vocal presence, right, with a chorus and with soloists and orchestra, to be based on Black folk music. You have composers who we didn't get a chance to talk to, like Scott Joplin, who actually wrote a ragtime, not a ragtime, he wrote a folk ballet inspired by Black folk movement, dance traditions, right? And we have other composers that we'll talk about later on who are really pulling from a very specific Black idiom. We talked about last time, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, for instance, pulling from a very specific style as being musical fodder for their music. He also has piano pieces, one of which I know we'll hear later today. One that comes to my mind is In the Bottoms, which includes a juba dance being one that has roots with African movement and uses a lot of hand and body sort of percussion, as well as what we mentioned already with art, using in his art songs African-American spirituals. He comes from in thinking about this particular time period, post-Reconstruction, post-Civil War, emancipation, yes, but all sorts of reincarnations of slavery and subjugation, very much at a time where there's Black intelligentsia and W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, et cetera, who are advocating for an elevation of and a unification of Black peoples, Blackness as being a thing, and what is that thing, and sort of naming it. He musically comes from this lineage as well too, with some other composers that we'll talk about and have already referenced, who want to try to showcase and highlight Blackness in this, what had really been presented as this European, Western, white tradition of classical music. So in the early 1900s, in thinking about this, I'll read in his own words so you get a sense, but what that meant for him to be able to showcase and highlight in this way the music of his peoples. So he says, quote, "We have this wonderful store of folk music, the melodies of an enslaved people who poured out their longings, their griefs, and their aspirations in the one great universal language, aka music. But this store will be of no value unless we utilize it, unless we treat it in such manner that it can be presented in choral form, in lyric, in operatic works, in concertos, in suite, and salon music, unless our musical architects meaning the composers, take the rough timber of Negro themes and fashion from it music which will prove that we too, as Black peoples, have national feelings and characteristics, um, as have European peoples whose forms we have zealously followed for so long." Um, I read this and I understand being in that time period what this means, but you have in that time period poets like Zora Neale Hurston who thought this as being blasphemous. Langston Hughes, who also wrote about this in his poetry, who thought this as being blasphemous of trying to um, closer associate Blackness with this sort of white central sun, if you will. And the only way to really validate this style of music, the rough timber of Negro themes, is to put it in this refined, very neatly packaged presentation of classical music. So it was incredibly controversial at the time, and still is controversial at the time to today, to be quite frank, about this association with a largely white dominant field, and where we fit into that, how much we fit into that. It's a very complicated and personal, I would say, issue that still pervades.
This is okay. First of all, this is the second time that you have said a quote that I was going to say.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is the second time. I think the first one happened on the first concert. I was so glad that you said the quote.
Oh, great.
And I was actually going to say this exact same quote. He wrote this in the Emancipation of Negro Music, which was an essay that he wrote when he was at Hampton University, when he was head of the music department there. So I'm so happy that you and I were on the same wavelength there. I did want to also add a couple of other things, which I think is really important. He studied with Arthur Foote at Harvard. You mentioned he went to Harvard. He also studied with Nadia Boulanger in France. He also was great friends with the political activist Emma Hackley, which he met at the Eastman School, and he had a very interesting take on jazz. And this goes to what you were just saying. He kind of thought jazz was sacrilege. He thought it was not used in the appropriate way that it was meant for. So this really, I think you're scratching on the surface of this dichotomy of where Black music should be and how it should be presented. So I wasn't privy to what you just said about that, but this makes sense because he wasn't a big fan of jazz.
And again, typical of the time, where in trying to elevate a entire culture and community that had been subjugated for so long, that often meant, thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois, also Harvard graduate student, of being learned in Greek scholarship, and pushing aside the Juba dance, or hambone, as what we may also call it today, pushing aside ragtime, which Scott Joplin, we know of as being a ragtime composer, but again, he wrote operas, he wrote music and classical music, what we would consider classical music, and thought German music was something that he really wanted to aspire to be known and associated with serious music, quote unquote. High art versus low art. Jazz was certainly at the time seen as that, as being low art. Music of the people, which is not how they wanted to be associated. So there's a lot of caste you had talked about earlier in your opening, conflict within the Black, certainly not monolithic communities, as it relates to religious music. Lots of churches would perform Handel Messiah, would perform Bach and Beethoven, because that was something to be cultured, right? And would maybe steer clear of some more vernacular kinds of music. So there very much was and still is this schism.
Well,
as it relates.
you're exactly right. We could talk about this all day because there's just so much here. But I'm going to say this one quick thing about this. It is happening today. I remember hearing an argument, between 5 and 10 years ago with some classical musicians talking about hip hop and how this isn't the music of Black people, and this music has affected the entire planet. So yeah, it continues. That argument continues, and it is well alive. And we're going to listen to Nathaniel Dett right now. We're going to listen to his Magnolia Suite number 1. It's in 3 movements. Magnolia, it's the first one, Magnolia's Desert Cabin, and My Lady Love is going to be performed on piano by our very own Judy Conrad. Of course, I'm having to remember to unmute myself. Fantastic piece of music. Thank you, Judy, for playing that for us. So we're moving on now to Florence Beatrice Price. She is an amazing artist, composer, born 1887, and she died in 1953. Actually, the next two composers grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. And Miss Price was one of three children. Her father was the only African American dentist in Little Rock growing up, and her mother was a music teacher who kind of gave her tutelage when she was growing up in her beginnings. She gave her first performances when she was 4 years old, and her first compositions when she was 11. She graduated valedictorian when she was 14, and she enrolled at the New England School of Music here in Boston, thereabouts. Let's say here, Greater Boston. Majoring in piano and organ. And I'm curious, Ashley, NEC is your alma mater, yes? I'm just curious, did you get a lot of exposure to Miss Price while you were there?
Unsurprisingly, no. And only within maybe the past 5 or 6 years, we'll continue on with Florence Price, who eventually moved to Chicago. And some years ago, recently, there was a large, surprisingly unexpected just acquisition of music that scholars had thought had long since forgotten or perished in an attic, which ended up being Florence Price's attic. And at around that time, there was a great sort of resurgency. Oh my gosh, Florence Beatrice Price! Let's discover who this woman is and present her music. So at the advent of this sort of discovery, and I use air quotes because she was never lost in some circles, and it's a very sort of colonial mindset to think of discovering something that already has been in existence. But in any case, at the advent of this a huge amount of music and letters and archives and correspondences, journals, manuscripts, unfinished pieces or parts of pieces that again previously had been thought to have no longer been in existence were found. There was a sort of resurgence of people who had connections. Schirmer, for instance, who had denied her publication during her lifetime, but now acquires most of her music. New England Conservatory invited myself to interview the now late Dr. Raylinda Brown, a phenomenal Florence Price scholar, and interview her and literally just get to hear her talk about all things Florence Price, and having lots more performances and scholarship in more recent years about Florence Price. Same with Coretta Scott King, who went to NEC. Now there's a bust that the Black Student Union I know was very much a part of, but certainly not during my time in the early 2000s at NEC was I aware of the Johnsons, for instance, who wrote the Negro National Anthem, and certainly other composers who we'll talk about later on today who had gone through those doors.
It's actually quite interesting, and I'm glad that it's happening now, but I'm also a little bit saddened that it's happening now. Well, let's shine that light. Let's continue to shine that light and give that notoriety. Just like our next composer, William Grant Steele, they both studied with George Chadwick. She actually graduated with honors from NEC, and then she taught at Clark Atlanta. Married a lawyer, moved back to Arkansas, and they had to leave there. They were part of the Great Migration because of the lynchings and the Jim Crow laws and such. And then she found herself in Chicago and divorce. What happened?
Well, a lot of things, and divorce is certainly, as we know now in this country, not a phenomenon or not sort of an unexpected turn of events. But she did find herself being a single mother in Chicago, and during her time as a single person, needing to certainly work, promote herself as both a phenomenal musician, a performer, as well as a composer, and really help amplify Black artistry in general. I'll retrace a little bit before getting to that time in Chicago, and just also make a link that during her time in Arkansas growing up, the Presbyterian Church was a major part of her life. And as I had referenced earlier, Black churches at that time were performing Handel Messiah and were performing Western European classical music as it relates to, again, this sort of assimilation and ascension and being cultured mindset. So she, from a young age, had experience already with this music, and also was very steeped in African American spirituals and Black traditional dances. So she had many different influences, as is typical at the time. What we had already talked about with Robert Nathaniel Dett. She, in coming to Boston, some of the most beautiful stories that I've heard and read about her as an organist, being a typical of organ study, but also being exceptional as it relates to her as a musician, sight reading full scores at sight, and certainly the improvisation that comes with organ study, being able to have a melody sort of thrown at you, kind of thinking of Blind Tom here, have a melody thrown at you and then being able to create something. She had such a command of technique and artistry, sometimes would showcase that off. And thinking of Bach, for instance, who would create huge fugues. She did something similar in a string quartet, not the one that we'll hear today, but her 5 folk songs and counterpoint, and just showed her contrapuntal prowess in her music, using folk songs, African American folk songs and other folk songs as her musical inspiration. Arkansas, married, divorced, ends up coming to Chicago, and really ends up having a new family, I guess I'll say. And that family included Black intelligentsia. It was not Harlem, but it was its own Harlem at the time in Chicago. So you had among colleagues Marian Anderson, who she could write songs for and perform in Washington, D.C., for instance, a great contralto, or Langston Hughes, being a friend, a fellow educator as well, and being able to take his poetry and set it into song. Black women, as I hope we know, have been bedrocks for so many things, and no different than in Chicago. So there was so many social clubs, the National African American NAM, National Association for Negro Musicians. Am I coming up with the right
Acronym?
description of?
I think so.
Yes. Yeah. Was spearheaded in Chicago. Margaret Bonds, as well as other African American women at the time in that space, really spearheading the collegial aspect and supportive aspect of promoting their music. Margaret Bonds being Florence Price's student, but also one who was very well steeped in the community to be able to help advance and promote scholarship and excellence as it relates to Black artistry.
And roommate. They lived together as well.
There you go. They lived together. Florence Price wrote her piano concerto that Margaret Bonds ended up premiering. They both entered the Wanamaker Foundation competition. Florence Price winning top prizes. Margaret Bonds, her student, winning also top prizes at the same time. A very tight knit, woven community where everyone really knows each other, and there's so much support behind the scenes. So what we think of as Harlem and the bedrock of Harlem Renaissance also really happened in Chicago, and to this day has a well knit Black community, Black artistic expressive community. And speaking about that Wanamaker Prize, I'll just reference that a little bit with her symphony in E minor, her first symphony, which won first prize, cash prize, and also the opportunity for the Chicago Symphony to perform it in 1932, 1933-ish. And that launched her into being, one of the firsts, which we'll also talk about with William Grant Still, I know, being a man of many firsts, but Florence Price being the first African-American woman to have a major U.S. orchestra perform her piece, to perform a symphony of hers. And that symphony has clear African-American elements in it. It has a juba dance, what we might think of as being the scherzo in musical form. She inserted a juba dance, which again is also known as ham boning, a lot of padding of the body, a lot of body percussion, large and small African drums, and if not verbatim spirituals, then the essence of spirituals, so pentatonic and using minor thirds, that sort of thing, and evoking this very distinct African American sound world. I shared, as you had asked me a question about NEC specifically, and knowing Florence Price during her time, just her sort of legacy and promotion of herself, approached the Boston Symphony Orchestra, again, having studied literally across the street in 1943, Kuczewski, who was the conductor at the time, saying, I have two handicaps. I'm a woman in black, but regard my music as being worthy in and of itself. Don't let my handicaps, and I put those in air quotes, right, deter you from the quality of my music. They did not perform. There was no response. Didn't perform during her lifetime. And it would take 76 years, March 2019, 2 years ago, for the BSO to perform any of her music. And it was actually not in its entirety. It was only one movement of her third symphony. And I think it was adapted. But in any case, her music is incredibly rich. There's such, for me, it transports to a certain time and a feeling and a place. I could feel the heat of the South when I hear her music. I can imagine, I always say sweet tea and hammocks when I think of her music. And there's so much color and history and personality in her music, which ranges from solos, chamber, orchestral work, vocal work as well too. So she is receiving credit long overdue, and certainly there are other African American women. Margaret Bonds, who we referenced, who you can now get her unpublished art songs through the Hildegard Publishing Company, which promotes the music of women, edited by Dr. Louise Toppin, amazing soprano, educator and advocate for African American artistry and music, as well as other African American women, certainly in the early 1900s and before, and obviously still creating and still performing and still expressing through music today.
There's just so much to talk about. I mean, we could be here all day. So I will say one quick thing, which when you said the Boston Symphony and her handicaps, when she was in Chicago, she actually worked under a pen name, VJ, because it allowed her to work as a woman in this field. Yeah, it's totally very interesting. Here, we will hear a performance of Adoration by the Fall River Symphony Orchestra Strings. That's such a gorgeous piece. I like it a lot. So, one other composer to discuss today. The dean, as he is sometimes referred to, of African American composers, William Grant Still. Born in 1895 and died in 1978. Again, he was born in Mississippi, but he grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas. His father was a band leader, but he passed away when William Grant Still Jr. Was 3 months old. And his mother taught English at high school. And he played all sorts of instruments. So, William Grant Still.
Yeah. Um, he is definitely deserving of that title, Dean of African American Composers. While there were certainly, as we've already talked about, other composers at the time who were creating solidarity in Black community and identity, those that we talked about today, Samuel Cord Taylor also comes to mind, and really showcasing Black artistry as it relates to this style of music, Western classical music. He really was a man of many firsts who was able to draw from so many influences and really um, kind of chameleon-like, or at least have 20 feet, it seems, in many different worlds at the same time. Um, he, ironically enough, was really encouraged by his mother, whom you referenced, at a young age to study music, but early on sort of took a shift and said, okay, I want you to do something more lucrative, which is a conversation we certainly hear a lot in modern times, like medicine or something like this. And he actually, fortunately for us, didn't listen to his mother and eventually dropped out of trying to pursue that medical path, where his school actually didn't have a music program, and ended up transferring to Oberlin and studying, as you referenced, with George Chadwick later here in the Boston area. He started as a young student on violin, self taught and sort of taught through the family, and learned by the age of 14 clarinet, saxophone, oboe, double bass, cello, viola, and I'm still trying to just perfect viola, one of those instruments. So to think about the musical curiosity, being in a program that only had a band program, for instance, and he played violin. So what else would you do apart from learn the clarinet and the saxophone and the oboe so that you can be a part of that band? He performed as an oboist in the musical Shuffle Along, which had a star-studded cast of African Americans: Roland Hayes, Paul Robeson, sorry, among others. Josephine Baker, I think, was also in this musical. He performed violin in the Navy when he had enrolled as well too, performing in blues bands and other spaces that he ended up finding himself in. As a man of many firsts, he was the first African American to conduct a major U.S. orchestra, that being the L.A. Phil, at the Hollywood Bowl, performing his own music in 1936. First African American to conduct in the Deep South in 1955, conducting the New Orleans Philharmonic Orchestra. First African American composer to have an opera produced, Troubled Island, which had lyrics by Langston Hughes and Verna Avey and depict the Haitian Revolution. And that was premiered in New York City with the New York City Opera in 1949. The Metropolitan Opera had been presented, and they said no. So there's a lot of contentiousness around what we call now is sort of gatekeeping and the access of visibility as it relates to a lot of these composers. He would later not be dissuaded by that and go on to write many operas, 8 or 9, I believe. He was also, if that isn't enough, the first African American to have an opera performed on national radio, and the first African American to have a symphony performed by a leading orchestra, which I feel pride for, being that was the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra led by Howard Hanson, my hometown being Rochester. and it was his Afro-American symphony, which really infused, again, the blues bands and the jazz, which had been sort of sneered to some extent, as we talked about earlier, high art versus low art, and sort of where as Black peoples we want to find alignment in. But he included a lot of these idioms in this symphony. And it was premiered in 1931, later went on to other orchestras throughout the country, and also went to Europe. And I think specifically of a performance in Berlin in 1933, where, if I'm not mistaken, the third movement, if not the second movement, one that has, if you close your eyes, you could see New York City in 1920, just vibrant colors. You could see smoke from smokestacks. You could see like the dirt and the grit and the heat. You could envision this in his music. It received such praise and was really taken by this Berlin audience, who was very used to not clapping in between movements, right? Wild, thunderous applause, and they refused to let the concert proceed, totally breaking with tradition until it was repeated. That, for me, harkens back to a time in Beethoven's era where you would have multiple performances of the same movement in the same concert, type of a thing, encore, encore, for instance. He really was someone who brought so much of his life, of his lived experiences, improvisation, blues, African American spirituals. He studied classical music. He studied avant-garde with Varese, spirituals that he heard again from his grandmother growing up, and infused those sort of naturally and proudly in his over 150 works, whether they were for film or TV or symphonies, chamber music that we'll hear today, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I want to remind our audience that the Fall River Symphony Orchestra played his African American Symphony, and we had a blast. The audience loved it. I remember, I think it's that third movement, dun 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 dun, bum 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 bum, dun 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 dun. Dun. It has this banjo in there that was just amazing, fantastic work. This is a lyric quartet performed by the Fall River Symphony Orchestra, principal strings. That was amazing. Okay, that was awesome. Wow. Thank you all for joining us this beautiful Sunday afternoon. We've had a fantastic concert, and we have one more left in our cycle, in our series. May 19th, 16th, sorry, May 16th. You're not going to want to miss this. Okay, here is the lineups so far. Well, we will have Castle of Our Skins. Ashley will be on our panel. We will also have two prominent composers. Renee Baker, she is with the the Modern Orchestra Project of Chicago. And she's a great composer, painter, all-around artist, fantastic
Violist as well, too.
Is she a violist?
She absolutely is.
Wow. And we will have Chichi Nwaku. I hope I'm
Nanuku.
Nanuku. She is the founder of the Chinique Orchestra, which is the first European majority Black and Asian professional orchestra. She's the founder of that organization. She will be on that panel, and Adolphus Helsdorf, which is again one of the great African American composers, will be with us, and we are so lucky to have such a rich, fantastic panel to bring to you. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you for coming today, Ashley. Thank you for coming.
Sure. Thanks for having me. My pleasure to be here.
And we also want to just thank again the Narrows. We love being here, and we will see you next time.